Hi guys, Sam here. On the 1st of April, I'll be raising money for sick, disabled and disadvantaged Aussie kids by taking part in the Variety Spin for Kids Charity Day. Last year, I was able to raise over $500 as part of my team's $2,000 goal with a number of incredible donations from people around the internet wrestling community. This year, I hope we could do it again. Variety are a great charity that are able to step in when government support doesn't reach people in need, providing things like wheelchairs, communication and hearing aids, medical services, therapy, and more for young kids. If you'd like to get behind Variety and support my ride, there will be a link in the podcast description and also on my Twitter. Thanks in advance, but now let's hit the music and get on with the show. Welcome to the AEW Match Guide podcast, where we deep dive into the best matches in AEW history. Brought to you by the Social Suplex Podcast Network and your host, Sam Brown. Yes, hello, and welcome to the AEW Match Guide podcast. I'm your host, Sam Brown. Thank you for joining me. Every week, alongside a special guest, I take an in-depth look at one of the best matches in AEW history, taken from the definitive AEW Match Guide, as ranked by over 30 wrestling commentators from around the internet wrestling community. If you enjoy today's show, you can subscribe and rate it on your podcast app of choice, and make sure you check out all of the other great shows on the Social Suplex Podcast Network that cover all aspects of the world of pro wrestling. My guest for today is a writer for Pro Wrestling Musings and a very fun Twitter follow. His name is Wrestling Rhymes, Dan, and we're looking at a singles rivalry between Cody Rhodes and Darby Allin. How are you going today, Dan?
Yeah, good. Thanks for having me on.
Excellent. It's fantastic to have you on. I've loved what you do on Twitter for a long time, so it's fantastic to meet you and chat to you. One of the things that I love that you do is the counter that you had going with disqualification. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's one of those things I noticed a while ago. It suddenly occurred to me that AEW had so few DQs, so I thought, well, let's compare that to WWE, and I was actually quite surprised by the numbers myself. I think at the end of last year it got up to something like 91-2, I think the year finished, or something like that, in favour of WWE's disqualifications. So I haven't actually been keeping up with it this year so much. I need to get back onto that, but because AEW have slightly changed their approach this year, so they actually got up to it.
They started out the very first show. Very first show, they started out with a DQ, and the first thing I thought was, oh, damn!
It's ruined my whole gimmick.
They beat WWE to the punch. At the end of last year, actually, I was cheering for WWE to try and make it to 100. I was like, come on!
They were close.
Get to 100. I mean, for them, it's not that hard. They've got 3 shows. They just need to do like one on each show a week, and they'll smash it out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, look, we're not here to talk about WWE. As I said, we're actually here to talk about a whole rivalry today. Normally on the podcast, we talk about just the one match. But today we're talking about the rivalry between Cody Rhodes and Darby Allin and the 4 singles matches that they had. And the reason that we're doing things a little bit differently is I think this is such a great example of how you can build up a wrestler over time and how you can build up a rivalry and develop it across a number of matches. And I think by looking at all 4 matches at once, we're going to see how well they did with this program. It's actually really fascinating to look at. And we're going to see how unique and how good this program is. So strap yourselves in, guys. We've got a lot of stuff to cover. But as we always do here on the podcast, the first thing I want to ask you, Dan, is how did you get into AEW?
When I was before AEW started, there wasn't a huge amount else to watch in terms of what was easily available. So I was still watching WWE at that point, but I'd already sort of started to veer away towards things like New Japan. I watched Stardom quite a lot. It's probably one of my favourite promotions. And I'd actually been going to Progress here in the UK before all of the unpleasantness with Progress and how that all broke up. So when some of those names started to be sort of attached to AEW, it was immediately very interesting, and obviously they had some of the big names. I'd sort of fallen in love with the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega in New Japan, and it was just such a departure from what was on offer elsewhere in terms of Western wrestling, at least. And obviously watched All In, and that was superb. I just enjoyed that immensely. It was unlike anything I'd seen in any of the WWE shows sort of around then. And that was it really. And then I basically watched it from day one.
It's interesting. You're the first person who I've spoken to that specifically mentioned Progress, and it's easy to forget how big of a deal they were particularly in the UK, and how they were really doing some great stuff. I know, like, for example, if you're deep into Progress, you would be very fond of the name Jimmy Havoc. Obviously, like, a name that is very tarnished now, and Progress itself is. But it's easy to forget how much came from there, and how much hype it had around it at its peak.
Yeah, absolutely, and it provided such a platform for so many people. I mean, another name that's
Ospreay.
Yeah, exactly, Will Ospreay and people like that, and we'll go on to
Muddy Squirrel,
talk about it later. But one of the, exactly some
all sorts of unpleasant folk.
But people like Aussie Open, who are sort of back in the trend now, so a lot of them there, and just before it all closed down, Cara Noir is the one who's sort of coming through now, and I expect to see him sort of being picked up by someone at some point. But yeah, it was very influential. It's very much a shame how it all ended, obviously. And quite rightly ended. Well, I'd say ended. It's still going, and I did actually go to a show last month, the first time I've been since it sort of shut down in its first guise. So it'll be interesting to see what it does, but it's certainly not the same thing anymore. But yeah, it was hugely influential, and in terms of sort of the match styles, things that you see on AEW are much more similar to Progress than they would be to WWE, for example.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. We're here to talk about Cody Rhodes and Darby Allin. And of course, these two first met in 2019, when very, very early in the promotion's history. I wanted to just ask you about both of the characters in this, both of the wrestlers that are in this feud. Cody Rhodes, of course, he was the heart of AEW at that point. He was the figurehead, the spokesman. He was very much the centerpiece, one of the centerpieces of the promotion. What was your opinion of Cody Rhodes in 2019?
I loved him in 2019. I think he's obviously become a very different character since then. But I loved him as that sort of head of the opposition as it was being built up. I mean, all the throne breaker stuff was all a bit silly, but I loved it. I thought it was, it was something that the wrestling world needed, really, and I think he sort of took that on his shoulders and became the real center of it. And he was also having some superb matches. And not long before this, the first Darby fight, I think, was the match with Dustin, which obviously was superb. And yeah, I just thought he was a great character at that point, and relatively straightforward at that point as well, which obviously as we'll see just across these four matches, that becomes less and less so with Cody, sometimes to his detriment. But in 2019, I thought he was a superb character. Absolutely.
He was in such a rich vein of form at that point. I really jumped into the Elite in 2018. I'd seen the Kenny Omega stuff in 2017, Kenny Omega, Kazuchika Okada. But the Bullet Club Civil War, where the Cody and Kenny Omega stuff was happening, that was when I really got captured by these guys and got into the Young Bucks as well. And, all of the ancillary players that they had jumping up and popping up on BTE, and started watching Ring of Honor. And then, of course, Cody had that incredible feud for the NWA championship with Nick Aldis, which was, it felt like something that wasn't happening in wrestling at the time. That particular program, the sporting way that they built it up, was really refreshing. And they also had lesser known. Obviously, they had the match at All In, but then lesser known at the NWA, I think the 70-something anniversary show, they had an incredible 2 out of 3 falls match as well, which may have even been better than the first match, but doesn't get the the plaudits just because it wasn't at All In. And then you have, of course, the Dustin match, which is just incredible stuff. There's me and the Doc Chad Matthews blabbered on about that for an hour a few weeks ago now. Absolutely the pinnacle of pro wrestling, and probably the pinnacle of Cody Rhodes in many ways as well. So coming into like this program in absolutely blazing hot form, and yeah, I was really loving Cody Rhodes at this point against my previous a lot of my previous thoughts about him. I hadn't been a giant fan of him in the WWE. I thought he'd done some great stuff, but I hadn't been a giant fan of his. But, he proved myself and a lot of people wrong with how incredibly white hot he was in 2019 and the things he was doing heading into this. Darby Allin is the man across the ring. He was absolutely the lesser known act at this point. Had you seen anything from Darby Allin before you saw him in AEW?
So I had seen him in Progress, in fact. So he'd been at the Super Strong Style tournament.
Oh, of course. Yep.
He was in that, but it wasn't really a huge sort of stepping stone for him. He lost in the first round of that tournament, I think, to Paul Robinson, and was then involved in some sort of multi-man matches the next day. So it wasn't a huge amount, but you certainly got the idea of what sort of wrestler he was at that point. Obviously the match with Paul Robinson was fairly crazy, as most of them are with him. But you sort of certainly got that idea that Darby was pretty much willing to do anything. But other than that, it was a very limited knowledge of him going into AEW.
So it wasn't Progress where he fought Walter?
I actually don't know. It's not one I've seen. I mean, I can't remember having seen that, but I can now imagine how that match goes almost to a T without having seen it, to be honest. Just Darby being blown up across the ring by those Walter slaps must be quite a thing to see. Yeah,
he had because the reason I bring it up is he had quite a rivalry with, it was Evolve that he had it in. There we go. Yep. So him and Walter had quite a rivalry, and I'd seen the climactic match of that rivalry where Darby actually finally got the win over Walter, and I'd also seen a match that he had with Pentagon. Both of those were recommended to me by a good friend of mine who was very high on Darby Allin coming into AEW and was very excited to see his involvement. What were your first impressions of Darby Allin? Obviously, you said you saw him in that match outside of AEW, but just, in the build up to this, in the lead up to this, when you saw video packages and stuff, what did you think of Darby Allin?
It was a very interesting character that they were sort of portraying. Obviously, he was being portrayed very much as the unknown quantity here. And, in terms of the sort of type of wrestler he was going to be, they weren't giving a lot away. Because I'm right in saying this was his first match, was it, in AEW?
Yeah.
The Cody match.
Yep.
Yeah, I was looking at that thinking we must have seen him before, but no, this was his first match. So it was more of sort of the dark brooding character. I think was it JR talked about having spoken to him on the day, and he was a slightly bizarre character. That's all they're giving away at that point. So they sort of kept him quite shrouded in mystery, I thought, which was quite good for when you then see him in this first match. Because they actually I think they let the match do as much of the talking as anything else, which I think is quite a clever way of doing it.
Yeah, and it was interesting, they didn't use him at he was signed before Double or Nothing, but they didn't use him at Double or Nothing, and they were scrounging around for people for that casino battle royale.
Absolutely,
so I'm sure the thought of him being in that crossed people's minds, but they made that conscious decision to leave him off this card because I think it was clear they wanted to give him a proper introduction, which is what we're about to get to. So yeah, let's jump into it. First match, Fyter Fest 2019. We'll give each match its flowers as we go on. This one, Big Papa Dave gave it 3.75. Cage Match currently have it rated at 7.42. And in the AEW match guide that we did back in 2021, this came in at 25th. So obviously, Fyter Fest 2019, it's only the second pay-per-view that AEW put on after Double or Nothing. The introductory video these guys had recaps the Cody versus Dustin match and has Darby at the end of it saying that while he respects Cody, he's going to beat him. And it immediately puts across how Darby is someone who is just really and completely driven to do the things that he wants to do. He is someone who, and we'll see this as he wrestles as well, but he's someone who gives himself completely to his goals and what he wants to do. Of course, he comes to the ring with a body bag behind him. And Excalibur explains the story behind Darby's face paint, how his uncle died while he was drunk driving, and Darby was in the car when he was very young, and how at that point Darby felt dead to humanity, and so that's why he paints himself. Cody comes out to an absolutely huge ovation with Brandy. As I said, he's coming off that fantastic performance against Dustin, so the crowd is absolutely into him. One thing that I thought was immediately clear during this introduction was that Darby gets how a camera works in wrestling. He's immediately like posing for the camera, eyeballing the camera. It's very natural. What did you think of the introductions that these guys got?
Yeah, completely sort of opposite to each other, but in a brilliant way. All that stuff that Excalibur was explaining around Darby's face paint and his history, that's the sort of thing that I didn't know at all at the time. That was all new to me, and a hugely important part of his character, and it was brilliant that they were putting all that across. And then you've got the very much the opposite of Cody coming out with Brandy on his arm, fireworks all over the place, very much the star versus the unknown. But as you said, I think in the promo video, Darby said, "I'm not going to kiss your ass. You might not know me, but as you said, I respect you." But and then that's what we saw in the match. So again, before they've even thrown a shot in the ring, they've really set these two up as sort of polar opposites that you really want to see fight each other straight away.
Yeah, and I think they do it in a really good way without sacrificing Cody's position on the card. Because obviously at this point, as we said, he's the face of the promotion. He's headed towards becoming the number one contender down the line. And so they do have to tread carefully in this because Darby Allin is he's a new introduced character and he's not someone who is on the same level as him. But they don't betray that. The introduction, even though, of course, you do have Darby Allin, who seems very fired up, very motivated, it's still obvious that Cody is a huge star and a huge deal in this promotion. So when they lock up, it's immediately clear what the dynamic of these two is. Cody has the power advantage. Darby Allin has the speed advantage. Immediately, Darby is able to outspeed Cody as they sort of chain wrestle, but Cody is able to overpower him. The interesting thing that I noted here, though, is that Darby is also able to technique Cody, which was something that I didn't think about until I did this rewatch, how often Darby is actually able to use speed combined with his sound technique to get an advantage. Cody is, as we said, he's got the power advantage and he's toying with Darby. What did you think of the way that these two first connected in the ring?
So, yeah, as you said there, it's obvious that there's the strength advantage from Cody. And I think they build it up that there will also be the wrestling advantage. I think quite early on, I think it's Excalibur uses the phrase that was Pro Wrestling 101 to explain something that Cody's done. And that's certainly the way they're building it up, almost as if we don't know whether Darby can wrestle at all in terms of technical wrestling. And as you said, he shows very quickly that he absolutely can. And it's interesting, they do build this up as sort of strength versus speed, but actually across the four matches, the actual speed of Darby Allin, I'm not sure is the thing that is highlighted the most. I think you do get a lot of this technical wrestling and sort of obviously the brutality of it as well. But yeah, it's interesting. I was expecting to sort of see lots of high flying bits from Darby early on to really show him up, but actually that's not what they do straight away. They actually show you that he's a good technical wrestler, and you see that perplexed face from Cody after he's I think he does that sort of armbar, the top rope armbar that he does, and Cody's got this sort of perplexed face and say, "Oh, I wasn't expecting that," and I think that's the look they were going for.
Yeah, it's interesting because Darby, the person he most commonly gets compared to is Jeff Hardy. And I think they've both got that devil may care attitude. Absolutely. They're both marching to the beat of their own drum. They both paint their face. But when it comes to the actual way that Darby Allin wrestles, I do think it's quite different to Jeff Hardy. I don't think it's a like-for-like comparison in the way that it often gets put over. Superficially, of course, absolutely. The attitude they have for life, absolutely. But from the get-go here, it's clear that this is a guy who is very fundamentally sound and very technically sound and is smart the way that he applies the skills that he has in the ring, which combined with, I guess, this devil may care attitude that we're going to see, it is a very potent combination. But as we said, Cody is the star in this match. He is in red hot form, and he is a lot more powerful than Darby. You know, like the way that he rips him down when he does a headlock takeover, it's like he has no regard for Darby. Darby doesn't have to do anything. Like, he is just throwing Darby around. And you can see that even though he is being constantly surprised by Darby's counters, Cody is very confident himself in how he is going to get the job done. And at many points just resorts to blunt power, brute force, and it's successful. And I love how in this you see when Cody is laying in the punishment. I love how Darby sells. It's so visceral. The way he moves his body around, the way he flails, bends his body. It's so visceral. I really like the way that he sells.
Absolutely. And the point around the power. So after that first bit of wrestling where Cody looks perplexed, I think the first thing he does is basically hurl Darby out of the ring via the ring post. And it's the first sort of sign of, you know, a lot of people would protect themselves in one way or another, but Darby just goes straight out as a normal human would, effectively. And it looks, as you said, so much more painful and brutal than anyone else we've seen. And then, yeah, he follows that up because after that, there's a fairly lengthy sort of period where Cody's in control of this particularly brutal looking sort of rib breaker that he does, which again, it looks like it's sort of Darby just, as you say, folds up. Again, I think it's that reality. It looks like how I would react if someone did that to me. Whereas if you see it from a lot of wrestlers where, you know, well, that's not how a body works. But Darby just looks very genuine. And that's why I think you really get that within the first 10 minutes of this match.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we said, of course, Cody is in control for the majority of this match because that's the story of this match. As we said at the start, Cody is the star. He's in control, and he is bordering on taking Darby Allin lightly. In fact, he is taking Darby Allin lightly, and that is what will happen. That is what will ultimately cause this match to have the result that it does in the end. Darby does fight back, though. So Darby fights back into the match, and he does it in like the most cool, scrappy way. He just goes after Cody's hand. There's this moment where he has a chance to like get Cody's hand stuck in the corner post, and after that, he's like a shark almost. He sees it, and he just everything at that point is going after Cody's hand. He's biting it, headbutting it, twisting it. He is so scrappy in the way that he goes after it, and I love that about him. He's so tenacious, and at the same time, as I said, like he's still selling and still in a lot of pain. I feel like often wrestlers will do it because they'll almost try and understate their selling. They won't. It'll be like they don't feel the pain, but Darby, like if anything, he leans into it more. And it's not that he doesn't feel the pain; he just refuses to give into it, and he becomes scrappier and scrappier as things move on.
Absolutely. Interesting you point out the sort of the scrappy nature of him, because again, that's, I think as we go across the four matches, you see the way he sort of targets a limb in each match. I think going back to that idea that he's a technical wrestler as much as
we'll get to that later.
Exactly. But in this first match, it's much more of a sort of a scrappy attack of the hand rather than a sort of almost premeditated thought about it. It's the earliest stages of Darby Allin where he's really sort of relying on instinct almost in this first match. But as you said, he never forgets that doesn't forget he's in huge amounts of pain, and that feeds into everything he does. It's obviously a huge part of his character. It almost sort of feeds him going forward in the matches to a certain extent. He sort of feels like he needs that to get going.
Well, what's that tattoo on his chest? It's like it's not over until you're buried underneath the ground.
Yeah, they keep mentioning the relentless tattoo as well, and that's certainly how he comes across. And again, remembering that this is the first time that so many people have seen him, that sort of word relentless is very much describes how he approaches this match.
And it's interesting, the crowd does get behind Darby as well. You know, like this is a crowd that loves Cody Rhodes. He's like the savior of professional wrestling to this crowd. But when Darby fires up and when Darby has his comebacks, the crowd is right behind him. And this match goes quickly. Like it's 20 minutes, obviously. obviously it goes to a draw. Everyone who listens to this podcast is going to remember this goes to a draw. But it goes really quickly. And I think because of the way these two tell that story of Cody being a bit overconfident but being in control, and Darby Allin having these really surprising and scrappy comebacks, scrappier and scrappy as it goes on, the crowd really gets into it. And that's really evident towards the end of the match. Darby, of course, goes for a coffin drop while Cody is on the apron and completely crashes and burns. Cody rolls out of the way. Darby takes the full impact of the apron on his back, which gets a holy shit chant. Cody then puts Darby in the body bag. After that, hits the disaster kick. But that showboating, I thought that looked a bit stupid, and turns out it was showboating. And that's when he should have been able to win this. And then Cody gets desperate because he realizes that the match is coming to a conclusion and he hasn't put away Darby yet. He hits him with the belt, manages to get a crossroads, but can't make the 3 count before the 20-minute time limit ends. What did you think of the ending sequence?
Well, just the coffin drop onto the apron point. I think that's probably the moment that made Darby Allin in AEW. That's his introduction to the world as a crazy wrestler that he absolutely is. Just taking that bump is just insane. And as you said, the crowd react to it, and that's what they were going for. And I think that, everyone will look back at the moment that he arrived in AEW as the point where he missed a coffin drop effectively. But then from there, as you said, just Cody becoming more he's been in control of this match for large parts of it, but he starts to just get more and more desperate. As you say, the weight belts, which again is another trend we see across the 4 matches, as we'll see as we go on. You're right, the body bag section is quite odd. It looks very strange and doesn't make a lot of sense until you realize it was the part of that, him taking him too lightly, not doing what he needs to, not getting the pin, not not being the Pro Wrestling 101 guy that he's been built up as, and Darby has forced him to go there.
And possibly a little bit of the arrogance of Cody as well, because there's a tinge of arrogance to his character, even when he's a face. There's like a level of arrogance to him where he's like, this guy has come out with a body bag with my name on it. I'm going to put him in his place. I'm going to put him in that body bag and finish him off with that. And of course it doesn't work because it shouldn't, because that's not what the heart of your company should be winning a match with. But yeah, it's all part of this narrative. Of course, going to a draw. This is a really brave move for the company. What did you think of the idea of going to a draw for these two in Darby's first match in the company against, the heart and soul of the company? What did you think of the idea of that happening?
You're right. It's a very bold choice at the start, partly because you are risking diminishing your top star in Cody, partly because you're introducing a concept that isn't really in Western wrestling at the time. Time limit draws are obviously not a WWE thing. Obviously, people have seen them in Japan and obviously through older wrestling. But yeah, it's a very new concept to introduce. But it felt right even at the time. I don't think I ever expected the match to go to a time limit draw. And when it did feel absolutely right. And by the end of the match, rather than having taken Cody down to Darby's level, you've actually raised Darby up to Cody's level. Which I think was obviously the aim of that match, and I think it had the perfect impact. And obviously, I think they did it with this longer term story in mind at the time, and that's just something that AEW does brilliantly.
Yeah, a number of podcasts ago, one of the guys from the This Is Awesome podcast who I had on to talk about Jon Moxley versus Kenny Omega in the exploding barbed wire death match. He said a lot of what AEW was doing in its first year was teaching its audience how to watch it. And this is a match that does that so well, particularly with the time limit. It's something that they go back to when Dynamite starts as well. They have Pac and Jon Moxley fight to a time limit draw. And it's introducing the concept of the time limit and that being an important thing. And then we're now seeing that pay off and blossom in the matches that Kenny Omega and Bryan Danielson had, and then the match that Bryan Danielson and Adam Page had. And that's now an integral part of the promotion, is the fact that we've got time limits. We can use a draw and we can use it to build a story and tell a story. And that was what this match did. Of course, yeah, as you said, like it did wonders for Darby Allin. Like this immediately introduced Darby Allin. First match he's ever had. For most people watching, this was the first time they've ever watched him. The only reason I watched those other matches with him in it was because I knew he was going to be here, and I had a mate who recommended these matches as like this is who Darby Allin is. Watch them to get to know who he is, and it immediately establishes him as a huge deal in the company and someone that is going to be a big deal going forward, a young up and comer, much in the way they will do so with MJF, and then when they introduce Sammy Guevara into the inner circle, and later on as well when with Jungle Boy, establishing those four pillars early on, Darby Allin has, a really, really pitch perfect introduction. Before we get on to match 2, I just want to bring up something that happened a bit ancillary to this feud. But Sean Spears, we may never talk about him on the podcast again. He makes his debut after this match with that huge headshot with the chair where Cody it went a bit wrong and it kind of pulled up Cody's skin a bit and Cody was bleeding so badly. This was a really controversial thing at the time. And because we may never talk about it again, I just wanted to get your take on it and what you think of it and what you thought of that headshot at the time.
Yeah, it's one of those things that worked for AEW, didn't it? Because, it gave you that horrible visual shot of Cody, bits of his head falling off effectively from a failed gimmick chair. But again, a very risky thing to do early on. Like, everyone knows the issues around headshots with chairs. Like, to try and bring that into your storyline and, pretty close to day one was very bold, and it, almost went disastrously wrong for them, because that could have been much worse for Cody, and who knows where. So you can still see that scar on his head these days. It's something that couldn't have gone more wrong. But I mean, it's a gimmick that Sean Spears still lives to this day, so it obviously worked in that sense. I can't imagine that he was thinking he was going to be linked to that chair for 3 years when he hit that shot, and that probably wasn't the plan. But I suppose that's a sign of AEW reacting sometimes to their mistakes and making things work. But the other fascinating thing about that bit at the end of the match is seeing MJF still as a sort of babyface. He's still on Cody's side at this stage, so he's the one rushing to Cody's side to look after him with Brandy. It's just particularly seeing what we've seen in the last week or so. It's fascinating to see that development as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, the funny thing about that though is like a whole bunch of people rush out, like SCU rush out. Like these people from BTE that have not shared the screen with Cody since, possibly, but at the time were sort of linked to Cody. They rush out and they're like trying to help him. MJF like shoos them off because he's still a prick, right? He still wants everything to be about him. He's like, no, he's my friend. I'm going to be the one that helps him.
Well, it's perfect because we all knew he was a bad guy anyway from BTE. Like they weren't hiding around that. But it's actually what's quite interesting about watching these 4 matches again. You actually see stories that have nothing to do with Cody and Darby developing behind, and again, I'm sure we'll talk about that as we go.
Yeah. Okay, we will move on to match 2. We're going to probably just for the listeners, we don't have time to do the full in-depth review of all 4 matches, so we're going to sort of brush over matches 2 and 3 a little bit to focus on match 4. But it's definitely worth mentioning a few things from match 2 and 3. Match 2, of course, happened on January 1st, 2020, the New Year's Dynamite, which was almost a bit of a reset button for the company after a rough couple of episodes in December. It's funny looking back at that, how we've now seen how the cycle works in many ways for AEW, how they'll like heat things up and cool things down. And it's interesting to see how December's never been a great month for. I don't think I've ever had like a banner December for AEW, but at the time we didn't know that. And at the time, of course, the stakes were quite high in that they hadn't signed a TV deal that they will sign in January 2020, which would probably go on to keep them afloat during the pandemic. But the Dynamite January 1 was a big deal, and this was the first match on the night. Cody Rhodes versus Darby Allin. Dave Meltzer gave it 4 stars. Cage match rated 7.55. Didn't come in the AEW match guide. We'll talk about which one was best at the end. The framing of this match was how the Elite had been losing since AEW started. Of course, Cody lost the match with Chris Jericho at Full Gear 2019. Kenny Omega lost to Jon Moxley. The Young Bucks had been beaten by Private Party in the first round of the Tag Team Championships thing, and they had that final segment where they got beaten up by the Dark Order. So the framing of this whole thing was, are the Elite still winners? Are they still the Elite? And it's interesting to see Cody being sort of bundled in with the Elite still at that point. He is sort of kind of splitting off because the first thing we'll see is on the debut of Arn Anderson, introduced as the head coach of the Nightmare Family, but still bundled in with the Elite group at that point. And this match, I think it immediately sets up sort of a similar thing. Cody Rhodes gets the best with shoulder tackles early, but Darby Allin is able to use his speed and technical ability in the chain wrestling early on to even the score, with Cody getting directions from Arn Anderson on the outside. Just generally with this second match, what were your thoughts on it, Dan?
It was interesting you were saying there about this sort of the repair job that AEW were doing here after that disastrous the fake punches and the strange blood and all of that went on that December show. And
it seems such a small thing, but at the time it was a big deal.
It felt big, didn't it? And they open with Cody to fix that, and that again shows where he was at that time, but also where Darby had come. Like, they wanted Darby to be part of that rebuilding job that they had to do. And as you said, it's part of the development more of Cody here, I think, than Darby, because you see Arn Anderson be involved. And I'd again forgotten that this was the first time we saw Arn Anderson with Cody, which is a huge development, and again a huge part of the storyline across the 4 matches. But yeah, as you said, the start is quite similar. You get that strength for strength. You see more wrestling from Darby, I think, in this match than you do in the first one. They've obviously already established him as a great wrestler at this point. But you see some very similar spots. So the point I mentioned earlier, where he hurls Darby sort of through the ring post almost. We see exactly the same spot in this match. But Darby reacts to it completely differently. He fights back at that point. We've seen there's a sort of really violent leg sweep on the outside. And I think that's one of the first times we see his sort of insane suicide dive as well in this match.
Yep.
Which I don't think was seen in the first match. So there is sort of certainly development around it. But yeah, it's more of a Cody match than a Darby match, this one, I think. And you see that, let's say, towards the end, when it's Arn who helps him win the match effectively.
I did like early on, they both tried, just in terms of differences from the previous match, I did like that early on they both tried to hit their biggest moves early, because obviously the first match went for a draw, so they both try and get off big moves. Darby goes for sort of the standing coffin drop, where he springboards off the ropes and hits a coffin drop to his standing opponent. Cody catches him and tries to go for a crossroads at that point. So obviously both of them are trying to make sure the result they had previously doesn't happen. We mentioned the first match, Darby goes up, really relentlessly goes after Cody's hand. And in this match, Darby really relentlessly goes after Cody's shoulder. And this really caught me off guard. The fact that Darby in this, and we're going to see in the third match as well, he is the one that's constantly going for a limb. He's finding a weakness and he's just relentlessly targeting it. And obviously he's smaller than Cody. He's lacking that power, but he is making up for it with his wrestling IQ and his scrappiness and his relentless doggedness and willingness to just do anything he can to target the weakness that he has identified. Like he's ripping off the turnbuckle. He just goes after that shoulder in a way that is, very, very deliberate and determined, and it helps put over both of them, really. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's, as you said, I think it's more methodical than in the first match. That sort of scrappy attack on the hand in the first match felt like a sort of more of a desperate move. This feels more like a wrestler who knows what he's doing. He's found that weakness and he targets it. And yeah, a very methodical approach. And as you said, it's something we see further on in the 2 matches. And agree with you, it wasn't something I associated with Darby Allin really until watching these matches again. This idea that he's the wrestling IQ, the fact that he will focus on a limb, sort of Bret Hart approach to wrestling that you just don't really necessarily link with Darby because of all of the other stuff that he does.
Another big callback is towards the end of the match. There's a huge avalanche code red, very close near fall. And then Darby does his over-the-top stunner, which gets Cody set up for a coffin drop. Cody rolls to the apron. Of course, at that point was where Darby crashed and burned in the last match. Darby thinks about it and goes for it anyway because it's Darby Allin. That's who he is. He's not going he doesn't care that he missed the last one. He's still going to go for it anyway. This time he hits it, but Cody gets the knees up, and it sort of damages them both. Back in the ring, Darby goes for another stunner, but Cody catches him into the crossroads. Really cool counter where Darby flips over and at the last minute, Cody catches him for the crossroads, gets a 2 count. Cody charges into the exposed turnbuckle in the corner, and Darby goes for another coffin drop. Arn tells Cody to put up his knees, and then Cody, after the knees go up, Cody manages to get a roll up for the win. What did you think of this match all up?
It's a great match. I think it's more of a pure wrestling match than the first one, partly because you're not doing as much introductory work for Darby Allin, I suppose. The people know who they are, so they are able to go 100% their own way in this match. And I do love that the lore of the coffin drop that they build into this feud. In that moment where he hits the coffin drop on Cody, and it's still quite unclear whether the knees come up deliberately on the apron or whether it's just if you coffin drop someone on the apron, you're going to hurt both people anyway. And as you said, the fact that it's Arn Anderson who has to tell Cody what to do on this one. So even though Cody ends up winning, it still feels a little bit like it wasn't Cody winning it. And it's something that I think we'll talk about it in the video package for the third match. I think Darby Allin says, I didn't lose to Cody, I lost to Arn. So it's still protecting Darby Allin whilst also getting your big star a big win. Yeah.
But you feel like in this match, Darby he is getting closer to that win. Like the first match, he was probably never going to win it because even though it ended in a draw, that was Cody's fault for taking Darby lightly. In this match, Cody does not take Darby lightly at all. He's trying to get the win from the start, and he does get the win, and he should get the win. And it takes 17 minutes, but he gets it. But Darby, he's now had a match with Chris Jericho. He's had a match with Jon Moxley. He is developing and he is building, and he got closer in this match. He got Cody into a position to hit the coffin drop, and Cody managed to get his knees up, which was the way that Cody won, was to get those knees up. Darby inching closer. This is a generational thing. At the moment, Cody is definitely still the one that's winning, and he's still ahead of Darby, but Darby is getting closer. And it's interesting to see as we move into match 3 how that plays out again. Of course, match 3, Dynamite. It's the TNT title tournament, the semifinals of that tournament, April 30, 2020. This one wasn't rated by Dave Meltzer, didn't make the match guide, did get 6.64 in cage match. This is, of course, the one that they did at those Georgia tapings, so it's in QT Marshall's gym. This is actually the first match that we've gone back to on this podcast that happened in that gym. We have looked at the gym in Japan that they wrestled in that in the Japanese side of the women's contender tournament at the start of 2021. This is the first time we've gone back to the Georgia tapings that they had when the pandemic first hit and everything locked down. Just before we get into the actual match itself, what did you think about going back to the Georgia warehouse?
It's looking at the darkest timeline of a little bit, isn't it? When you go back to these matches, it's quite disappointing, and I suspect that feeds into some of the low rankings on Cage Match, for example. Like, it just didn't feel. This is still very early on in COVID times. I think we had a couple of weeks almost of wrestling, in these empty stadiums at this point. So
Well, that's why
just
Dave
it
Meltzer
didn't feel like
rate
wrestling.
it.
Exactly.
He didn't rate any of the matches. Yeah.
It didn't feel like wrestling in a lot of ways. And actually, I think this match is an anomaly in the four, and they do a lot of things quite differently in this match because of they're still learning how to do crowdless wrestling at this point. So it's not nice really to go back and look at, but I think they do a pretty good job with it.
It's funny, in my mind, I'd sort of rose-colored glasses this era, and I sort of love the story of it, the way they were able to like pull it all together. Because I'm not sure if you've heard the story or if the listeners have heard the story, but they had a taping in Jacksonville at the stadium in Jacksonville at Darby's place, and then they found out that Florida was going to get shut down, so they rushed to Georgia. They could only get 20% of the team to Georgia, and they within 2 days of just working full time, they put together 6 weeks of TV. And I don't know, for me, I love the story. I love like the idea of them just doing what they can, like you've got Chris Jericho on commentary with Tony Schiavone, you've got Cody on commentary, you've got these random people in the crowd like Pineapple Pete from this era, and like I think of these things and I think back with rose-colored glasses, but honestly going back to it lost its charm within like 3 minutes being back in this warehouse.
At Kroger, we believe fresh means holding our produce to a higher standard. That's why we do up to a 27-point inspection on our produce. Like for citrus, we check for things like scarring and sunburn. Yep, oranges can sunburn, and we'll make sure you never see it. In fact, we only allow the best oranges, lemons, and grapefruits to reach our shelves. Because when it comes to fresh for everyone, we believe the juice is worth the squeeze. Kroger, fresh for everyone.
Delighted to see Pineapple Pete, though. That was a reminder of some of the good parts that they were able to do with that period.
Yeah, and I ended up watching some of the rest of this show, and you had the Dustin Rhodes Lance Archer match, which was also it was good to watch, and you had Mr. Brody Lee. It's a weird blemish on, not a blemish, but a weird moment for AEW. Yeah. It's a weird moment for wrestling in general.
Absolutely.
But yeah, as I said, it very quickly lost its charm, but this is a good match still. And we will talk about the actual match itself. So same pattern as before at the start. Darby is technical and fast. Cody is stronger. But this time it's the knee that Darby goes after. Cody kind of tweaks it as he comes over for a counter, and Darby notices it and immediately goes for a shoulder block on the knee. I guess there's a few different turning points in this match, but I don't know, for me that's where the momentum changes for Darby. At that point, Darby is very much in control, which is different to the previous way things have started. Darby is the one that's actually getting the momentum early. But when Darby runs into Brandy after Cody dodges a running shoulder block on the outside, that's when sort of things flip around. Just in general, what did you think of the way that this match built up, and then I guess how it related to the previous matches that these guys have had?
So I think, as I said earlier, that there's some definite differences in this match to the other two, and I think that's probably through necessity of the COVID era. That they needed to put a bit more bells and whistles around it because, a 20-minute match where you build up the technical wrestling, it just wasn't the environment for that, I don't think, at the time. But obviously they were still feeding that in. As you said, we got this time the focus on the leg from Darby, which again, further development of him as a very technical, very methodical wrestler, whilst also being this relentless character who will throw himself into it at every opportunity. But yeah, I think the Brandy bump then completely changes the dynamic of the match, because then we see angry Cody from then on, which is not something we've really seen in the first two matches, which sort of provides an interesting different dynamic in this third match, the first two.
Yeah, and you think about Cody's demeanor across the matches. You've got overconfident, taking him lightly, taking him seriously, but it's, this is a professional wrestling match, to this is now personal, and you got my wife, I'm pissed off at you. I think one of the things that I think this match doesn't work as well is, even though Darby is going after the knee quite relentlessly, there's a bit where he's just headbutting it, which, as we've said, technical, but also really scruffy at the same time. He has that pin that he does, the Last Supper. And and it's a really technical pin, but at the same time, he also will just headbutt the knee at the same time. But I don't know, knee matches, I feel like of all the limbs to work, the knee is the most difficult. I think very few wrestlers really sell it all that well. Not everyone can be Bret Hart getting his leg kicked out of his leg. And in this one, I think Cody does a pretty decent job. Early on, he's not letting it show too much, which is how it works in a real fight. You can't immediately stop walking the first time your knee gets hit out. But as the match progresses, it gets worse and worse. But just because, you still need to be able to get around a ring and do your moves, it does end up being slightly selective. So I do think that particular element, even though it works for Darby's character, doesn't work in the actual match itself. Also, the ads in the middle of it, they also took me out of it in a way that it didn't for the previous one. They really detract from the presentation of this match.
Which again, presumably is
what are you going to do?
Thing, because they presumably didn't even do picture for this, which because normally. Yeah. And you can understand why you're not going to put them through any more than they absolutely had to at the time. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you're right. Yeah. It's completely different to the others because you don't get that flow. You get 4 minutes of the match you just don't see.
Yeah. But there's some interesting contrast. Darby hits a crossroads in this match, which is a new development. And then, of course, we get the ending. And interesting, the length of this match is 20 minutes and 11 seconds, which I thought was interesting given the fact that they had the 20-minute draw early on. Obviously, this one wasn't done under a time limit for whatever reason. I'm not sure. They never gave a kayfabe reason, but the time for it is 20 minutes and 11, which I don't know if that's intentional or not, but it's nice symmetry-wise. As we're saying, though, Darby is catching up with Cody, and that's really evident in the final ending here. Cody hits a coffin drop off the top rope, but Darby gets his knees up, which is, of course, a reflection of what happened in their second match. But when Darby has Cody dead to rights, he hits the coffin drop, and Cody just manages to turn him over and move him over and position him as in a crucifix position, almost a crude crucifix position, and gets a 3 count after being hit by the coffin drop. What did you think of the ending? At the time, there was a lot of people who did not like the ending to this, but what did you think of it?
It's one of those, it looks clever in hindsight, and I think it does work within the story of this, but I remember at the time people being a bit confused by it, and I'm not sure if it quite went the way exactly they meant it to. It just looks a bit odd that Cody sort of took that coffin drop and then was just able to roll him over without. And it's not even as if he had him sort of tied up either. That's the thing. It's a slightly odd one. But again, it does work in the story that, as you said, Darby is inching closer and closer to getting that victory. So he's had a draw where he was probably dominated quite a lot. But in the second match where he has a lot more of the action and effectively only loses because of Arn Anderson. Third match where he has a lot more of the match. I think in this one, that's definitely the case. There's a lot more Darby offense in this one than in the previous two. And then he just loses out on sort of almost a slight technicality at the end. I do remember at the time that it was a bit odd, and it didn't feel like it quite gone to plan almost. As you said, the fact that they are using each other's finishes in this match is interesting. That's a development, and it shows that these two are almost sort of inextricably linked at this point to each other, that they are in each other's so much that they will use each other's finishes, and that's a really good development within this. It does have the slightly weird tacked on bit with Brandy coming back out with the water, and which again I think is probably again more to do with the fact that they had time to fill really, and technical wrestling wasn't really what was needed at the time. There's also a very bizarre moment in this match where Britt Baker hits Cody with a shoe, which I couldn't remember what was going on there. If that a developing feud between Britt Baker and Cody, or whether she was just hitting people with shoes at that moment or not, it was all a bit odd.
I think they're just throwing everything against the wall and seeing what starts.
Exactly.
I love that. I do love that. Tony Schiavone knew exactly what was happening, but Chris Jericho was like, "We still don't know what's actually happened there. We don't know that it was a shoe or not." They're just trying on anything at this point. And I mean, that's why part of me, even though, as I said, actually watching this back, going back to the Georgia place, I don't really want to go back there again. I don't know if I ever will for this project. I don't think there's any other matches from that period that really struck a chord at all. And even this one didn't. We're talking about it within the larger feud. But I don't know. I'm a romantic, and I just love the ramshackle nature that you've got. That Brit and Cody interaction is that in a nutshell. I'd never even thought about until it happened, and until I saw it again. But yeah, look, let's move on. We'll move on from the Georgia tapings, back to Darby's place for their fourth match at Full Gear 2020. Before this match, of course, both had sort of gone on a few journeys outside of facing one another. Darby had tried and failed in an AEW title shot against Jon Moxley. That's another fantastic match. But he did have sort of successful feud against Team Taz. We would eventually come back around to that after winning the TNT title. But at this point, he'd sort of been done with that and beaten the guys from Team Taz. Cody, of course, had won and lost and then won the TNT title again in some of what I would think is the best work of his career. Just before we get into this match, because it's actually the first TNT title match we've talked about on this podcast. What did you think of Cody's run as TNT champion?
I absolutely loved it. I thought it was brilliant. It introduced this sort of TV challenge element to it, which was superb, and I think fits Cody's character as brilliantly as well. It obviously introduced us to the likes of Ricky Starks, Eddie Kingston. Warhorse was probably the outlier there. That one didn't go quite as well, but still. And then obviously you had everything with the Brody Lee feud, which was just superb. It's when he destroys him in that match and takes the TNT title. It's one of my favourite moments of AEW history, to be honest. So I don't know if it came up in the ratings, because obviously it's quite a low.
Did.
Yeah, I was going to say, because it's such a short match. There's obviously not a lot to it, but it's more of a moment than anything else, and it's one of my favourite moments, certainly. But yeah, I think Cody had really elevated this title to make it feel hugely important, and that's where we sort of find ourselves on this match as well.
Yeah, in terms of the match guide list, you've got both of the Brody Lee matches showing up in it. So even that squash match, which was that was a flabbergasting moment, such an epic moment of professional wrestling. And then the dog collar match, of course, afterwards was fantastic. From that TNT title reign, you've got this match, and then you've also got the Eddie Kingston match made it into the top 50. So that's just some fantastic work. It was a really incredible run. It was exactly what the TNT title needed to be established as a huge deal within the company. And yeah, the cherry on top was the Brody. Well, better than a cherry on top. The Brody Lee stuff was just incredible. And then I think this is probably the cherry on top, honestly. So match 4, Darby Allin versus Cody Rhodes for the TNT title at Full Gear 2020. Dave Meltzer rated this 4.25. Cage Match rated this 8.03. And in the match guide, it came in at 23rd. So we've got a fun video package to start things off, sort of detailing what Cody Rhodes has been doing, detailing the rivalry these guys have had, and then some random bits that I'd completely forgotten about with Steve-O from Jackass announcing that Darby Allin was going to be the one challenging, and then Darby Allin skating with Tony Hawk, cool stuff, but I'd completely forgotten that had happened. Both of these guys get really cool entrances. Darby rides in on a busted up car. He's like hanging out the window with his skateboard, and his skateboard reads the face of TNT. And then he just like smashes that into the windscreen of the car when it stops. And he also had like really epic paint on at that point. It's like a tree, a black tree coming out. And the face of TNT stuff is, of course, related to the fact that one of the questions going into this was, can someone like Darby Allin be the face of TNT, compared to Cody Rhodes, who is obviously a very different kind of guy. And then Cody uses up his contracted percentage of the pyro budget and has like the entire Nightmare family out there with him. What did you think of also, big thing, this is the first time that he was able to use the Rhodes surname. What did you think of the intro for these two?
It's fantastic, the video package here. As you said, you've got the full Cody entourage situation in this point where I think he comes out in the middle, doesn't he, here? Because he hasn't actually been able to come out in his big solo middle cage thing in any of the other matches so far. But we see that here. There's hundreds of people with him. It's all say even more bells and whistles than we've seen elsewhere. It actually builds up throughout these 4 matches. It sort of comes out with just Brandy, then he has Arn, then he has Arn and Brandy in the 3rd match, and now it's everybody. So it's very much like it's entourage. But also he's much more sort of heelish in his video promo. He talks about I've been Darby's daddy on more than one occasion. I've beaten him handily, and again that flows into how he approaches the match. I think we're fully in the period here where of the Codyverse, where we weren't sure if he was turning heel or not. We'd had the hair color change during the Brody Lee stuff. I think everyone was questioning, is he going to go heel, is he not? So I think that sort of feeds into these sorts of promos that we were getting from Cody, and say Darby obviously now coming to his own with his the black and white videos were very much synonymous with him at this point, even if they did have people from Jackass in them. And as you said, the riding in the car, it's just very cool, and they use that a lot in Daly's Place, but this was a particularly good use of it.
Yeah. He they hadn't had this kind of a big entrance thing before. They sort of got a spotlight entrance in their first match. The second match, of course, was Jacksonville, set up the way that Jacksonville is now. The crowds are back because crowds were then. So you've only got the one small entrance ramp. And then, of course, the Georgia tapings, they were limited by the fact they were in a warehouse. But this was, a real big time feel. I wouldn't necessarily say they were in the Codyverse at this moment. Cody Rhodes at this point was still very much interacting with the rest of the roster. I would say this is probably the last match we got before he went into that, though, because after this you have him spinning off to other things. But let's talk about the actual match itself. Although I do love just how insane Cody's pyro was in this. Yes, my joke is that, like, in his contract he's got like a thing where it's like, if the pyro budget is $100K, I've got to have 20% of it. Like that's so I'm always going to have this chunk of it, no matter how much it is. So, and you mentioning that he is being more heelish fits with what we've seen in the development of this rivalry. As we said, the third one, things got more personal, and Cody was acting in a far more angry manner, and in a far more aggressive manner in their third match. And as we will see in this match, that only continues to ramp up. Big stare down at the start, and they're way rougher in the early exchanges. Cody's like intentionally pushing Darby around, kind of sledging him a little bit as he does so, and Darby responds by like slapping him in the face, in the back of the head, where previously may have like taken the arm and been a bit more technical. So yeah, like this has become more and more personal. Things have gone on. There's a great spot where Darby does like a springboard backflip off the ropes to launch himself into Cody's back, which I really liked. But the interesting thing was, of course, the first 3 matches we've made the point that Darby was working a body part. In this match, it's Cody that is the one working the body part, going after Darby's left arm. This is the first time that he's done that in one of these matches. So he taking what has worked against him previously and what has gotten Darby close to him previously, and he is trying to take that on and use that against Darby. It's a long way from where they were in the first match, where Cody's just sort of toying with him without really a plan on how he's going to do it, just trusting that he's going to put him away.
Absolutely, and they feed this into the influence of Arn Anderson as well, don't they? Here, they're saying that that's what he's been taught by Arn. That the arm work is very much like Arn. They're really building that idea up throughout. But what I thought was interesting in the start, you've got that sort of still a slightly dismissive nature of Cody in that opening exchanges. Like he does the little leg trip and sort of almost looks at Darby as if to say, you should have known that was coming. And you get a couple of moments in this where he's just like, yeah, I'm better than you now, and I'm still am toying with you a little bit. But as you said, Darby fired the bit where he just slaps him around the back of the head is superb. It's just it's just not very pure wrestling, but it's absolutely in keeping with Darby's character and how he reacts to Cody generally. But as you said, it's a very different approach from Cody in this, and we get the press ups again, which we saw that in the first match. and we see it here. Which again, so in the first match, he did it because he doesn't really know who Darby is. He doesn't respect him as much at that point. In the fourth match, it's because he thinks he's beaten him already, and because he's beaten him the previous 2 times. He's sort of gone full circle in that. And again, it's just it's very clever the way they weave those together.
Well, I think a lot of this, like a lot of that from Cody, a lot of his bluster and his sort of arrogance in this is him trying to put Darby in his place, because he knows that Darby is coming for him really hard. And he knows that over the past few matches, he has caught up with him and is on the precipice of beating him. And so he is doing everything he can to try and unsettle Darby and put Darby in his place, where he hadn't previously in the second and third match. He hadn't felt the need to do that. He sort of did in the first one just as a showboating thing. But in this, it's like almost a really desperate ploy for him to work the psychological game as much as he's working the physical game, which is, where he is really focusing on that arm. There's this really cool bit where Darby like launches off the ropes, but Cody immediately grabs the arm and grounds him with the arm and uses Darby's momentum flying off the ropes to like enhance the impact on that. And there's that avalanche hammerlock that you mentioned that they said was like an Arn Anderson move. And Darby, as we've said, we noted particularly in the first match, his selling is just incredible. And the fact that he like leans into the pain, it just makes it even better, because he just contorts and writhes, and just his facial expressions are just so racked with pain. And the interesting thing about this match, right, is Cody has things under control with his intense focus on the arm, but it's when that he loses control when he goes for a moonsault. So when he loses focus on the arm and he goes for a moonsault, that allows Darby to roll away and avoid it, and that's when Darby gets back in the match.
Absolutely. It's when he goes away from what's working that you really lose out on this. And the moonsault, I'd say, is really the sort of turning point in terms of Cody's approach to the match. From there on in, he's, again, sort of showboating a lot more. There's a bit where he just sort of dismissively body slams Darby a few times, which isn't really actually doing very much in terms of the sort of hurting Darby at that point, but it's him showing off again. It's just becoming a bit more. And as you said, whether that's because he's his own insecurity in terms of, well, can I beat this guy, or whether he actually just thinks, right, I'm done with him now. You also get, Arn shouting at Darby to stay down, which I think the commentators build that up as part of the psychological warfare as well, something that Arn's always done in his past. So yeah, it's a very different pattern to the other matches. But as you said, Darby is brilliant in this. His selling of the arm is superb. There's a bit where he goes for the sleeper hold, and he just can't even sort of cinch that in properly, because his arm is basically sort of dangling by his side, and it's just for someone that hasn't really been in wrestling for that long, that sort of level of selling is just, it's superb.
Yeah, but the relentless nature of Darby when he's got that sleeper hold is emphasized by the fact that Darby, as he holds onto it while Cody climbs up to the top turnbuckle and effectively does a coffin drop onto Darby with Darby on his back, and just puts his whole body weight on Darby, which, as we've noted, is far bigger than what Darby's is. But Darby holds onto it the whole time because he's like, you can put me into pain, but I will survive longer than you will, because I am tougher than you are. I'm more relentless than you are. And we see at the end, once again, we almost get back to where we were at the end of the first match, where Cody is really frustrated that he can't put Darby Allin away. We get the avalanche crossroads, and Darby manages to roll across the ring and get his feet under the rope, so he can't get that. And then we get Darby hitting a coffin drop for 2. Cody tries to backslide him like last time, but this time he kicks out at 2. And then we get Cody taking off the belt and going to use the belt. The referee, Mike Chioda, actually, for this one. I don't know if he's appeared in that many more AEW matches, but Mike Chioda takes the belt off Cody, and then Darby Allin uses it to trip him up. And we get him going for the coffin drop, hitting the coffin drop, but Cody kicks out at 2. Then we get a roll-up exchange, which after a bit of back and forth, Darby manages to hold Cody down for the 3 count, and Darby gets the win. What did you think of the ending of this match?
It's a sort of fascinating conclusion to all 4 matches, isn't it? Really, that's how this comes across. The coffin drop that Darby hits, he noticeably rolls away from Cody before going for the pin on that one because of what's happened in the 3rd match. Like, you've seen him learn from that. Again, it's not just thrown away that what happened in that 3rd match. Darby is learning as well, even though he's this sort of relentless, scrappy lunatic in sorts of ways. He is learning as he goes. And that end sort of sequence of pins is brilliant, and the fact that Darby out wrestles Cody Rhodes, who at the start of the match is introduced as the Prince of Pro Wrestling, with he out wrestles him at the end with that pin. It's a superb way to end the feud, because I think it would have actually felt a bit hollow if Darby had won it with a coffin drop. Like, he needed to do something else. That the coffin drop hasn't worked in the previous matches, so doing something else feels like the sort of necessary next step. And it's a superb conclusion to the feud as a whole.
Yeah, and you mentioned how at the start of the match, Cody is introduced as the Prince of Pro Wrestling. At like the very start of their rivalry, they were talking up Cody's credentials as like a former amateur wrestler, how he, is very technically sound. He's brought on Arn Anderson to, like give him that extra edge with the technique, with the gamesmanship. But in the end, Cody isn't the one that wins the roll-up sequence. It's Darby. And I really like that it's not done after the first one. They actually have a lot of back and forth on the same pin, which is not something you normally see. They get the win on this one, which was nice. I do think there's this who knows what's going to happen with Cody Rhodes at this point. I do think like there's room in this rivalry for like a 5th more emphatic win of Darby's. But I love how you do see Darby Allin catching up with Cody incrementally. And at this point, it is just like he's just snuck past him. And in this match, you've got Cody going as focused as he's ever been against Darby Allin, as aggressive as he's ever been against Darby Allin. But Darby Allin, through the experiences that he's gained wrestling in AEW, the experience he's gained wrestling against Cody for the first 3 matches, he has been able to tilt the generation, have that generational shift. And of course, Cody gets down on like one knee to present Darby Allin the belt, makes a big deal of it. I would love to see another match between these two, particularly after watching these 4 and the way that they've built so many things across these 4 matches. It's brilliant. Yeah,
and you look at what each of those guys has done since then. There's so much more in their storyline now. We haven't even seen Sting at this point, for example. Like, then that's where Darby is now. Obviously, Darby's had his own TNT title run and everything that went on with that. Cody has, as you said, disappeared into the Codyverse at this point, and as who knows where he's going to pop up. But it would be absolutely superb to see another match between these two. And it's the sort of match that, obviously, we don't know what's happening with Cody, as you said, but it's the sort of match that you could see being a World Championship match, not just on the TNT title list. So it would be good to see it again someday.
Oh man, I'm just getting chills thinking of Darby Allin finally being a world champion. Cody Rhodes has not been in AEW for many years. Just full, because gosh knows where Cody's going to end up at this point. Full disclosure, this is happening on the eve of Revolution 2022. That's when we're recording it. So, maybe Cody will turn up at WrestleMania. There's talks that maybe he's going to end up back at AEW at this point. So gosh knows what will happen. But, maybe there's a universe where down the line sometime Darby Allin becomes champion, and who's the one that shows up but Cody Rhodes to an open challenge, an open TV challenge. What a story that would be. Across these 4 matches, what would you say your favorite of these matches is?
I think it is the 4th one, but it's actually quite hard to take them individually anyway, because the 4th one is great because of the first 3. I suppose the only one you can take individually really is the first one, because it was the first match between them. But I think the story they tell in this 4th match, and the actual wrestling ability in it as well. It's just that you mentioned the Avalanche Crossroads. That's superb the way they do that. It's absolutely brilliant. Not one I've seen a huge amount from Cody, and certainly I don't think I've seen anyone take it as well as Darby does.
Mm.
So I think overall the fourth match is the one that that I enjoyed watching the most, having watched them all again. But as I said, I think it's because it's part 4 of 4 really.
Yeah. If you'd asked me before I sat down and watched all 4 matches for this podcast, I would have said the first one, just because I loved the boldness of it. And I loved the way that it introduced Darby Allin. I thought it was bold. I thought it was brave. And I thought it was a brilliant way to introduce someone who was going to be a big player. But now I have to agree with you. Now I've watched all 4. The way that these things sort of build off one another and then culminate in the 4th match, it's brilliant. It is really an incredible series of matches. And I was thinking about other rivalries like this one, and I don't think there are too many that are like it. We've seen plenty of back and forth rivalries, where iconic rivalries, even between generations, or even passing of the torch moments, for example. Like you think like Roddy Piper and Bret Hart, or Mr. Perfect and Bret Hart, or Shawn Michaels and Steve Austin. Like those sort of passing of the torch moments, but they don't have the build up that this one has. And then you've got other rivalries that are, where one person loses for a long time and then finally gets the win, like say Misawa Kobashi. But there's the only other cross-generational rivalry I can see that is like this, that shows someone from a different generation coming in and slowly clawing their way to beating this guy, is really rarefied air. Okada versus Tanahashi, which is slightly different, because of course Okada gets the first win in that series, but then it's a matter of Tanahashi dominating and Okada catching up with him, but then Tanahashi still being able to win at the Dome and Okada having to catch him at the Dome. So it's got some similar beats, but in a different way. Can you think of anything else that compares to what these two did here?
So they didn't complete this story in WWF, it would have been the time, but it very much reminds me of the 1, 2, 3 Kids versus Bret Hart's match.
Yeah.
In terms of the way that Bret doesn't expect much from him, and then they almost do all of it in one match rather than across 4. And off the top of my head, I don't think he goes on to beat Bret, so it doesn't have that same conclusion.
Yeah.
But in terms of you said rarefied air, the other one that I compare it to is actually Omega Okada, which obviously has 4 matches as well. It's not the same thing because you're not building up a character. Everyone knew who they were, but you do have that sort of 3 defeats for Omega before he eventually becomes Okada at the end. And again, in terms of the way they go back to reference the previous matches, that's something obviously that Omega Okada do brilliantly, and it's something that you see here. And as you said, it's hard to think of too many where they've actually kept that string going through across. It's over a year and a half? Is it that these 4 matches happen across? It's very that thread that goes through them is it's pretty unique, and the fact that we're talking about the likes of Omega Okada, Tanahashi, sort of shows how highly regarded this feud should be.
Yeah, I just love how because like Omega Okada, they're very much the same generation. In fact, Omega is older than Okada.
Yes.
Not that I'm not saying that's not the thing. I just think this feud is really unique in what it's doing, and particularly because the other one I compared it to, of course, is Okada Tanahashi. Okada sets a trap for Tanahashi in the match, but they're still very clearly similar levels, even though Tanahashi is slightly ahead. Like in the progression of these matches, you see someone who does go from a long way behind to just in front. As I said, I'd love to see like a 5th, more emphatic win from Darby Allin and see what that would look like at some point. The only other things I could think of were like outside of wrestling. It kind of reminded me of how like Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal in tennis interacted. You had Federer, who was the king at the time. Nadal like was winning on clay and then slowly started to beat Federer on other surfaces. And then you had Djokovic, who came along and similar sort of thing. Or the other one I could think of was Matt Hughes versus GSP in the UFC, where you had for the welterweight championship, Matt Hughes was a very dominant champion. And George St. Pierre coming up, He faced Matt Hughes, got beaten quite soundly. The second match they had was closer in GSP1, and then the third one was much more emphatically a GSP win. But the fact that I have to go to like these legendary tennis MMA rivalries for a comparison just shows how great this thing is and how almost unique it is. And I would love for people who are listening, if you can think of other comparisons, cross-generational, the way that they build each other and you see Darby Allin catch Cody Rhodes. I'd love to hear if anyone else has any thoughts on other rivalries that are similar.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, it's a very unique one. You can't reach for anything obvious elsewhere, and that just shows how well they crafted this. And actually, I think credit has to be given, not just to the two guys, but to AEW for doing this across such a long period. We talked right at the start about sort of almost re-educating people on how to watch wrestling in a certain way, that there hadn't been this sort of long-term storytelling is a bit of a meme in itself these days, but there hasn't actually been this sort of long-term storytelling, relationship building between people certainly in WWE for a long time. It's very much a Japanese wrestling trope, but not in the West. So credit to them and I do think they had this in their mind from that first match. I'm sure they had to deviate slightly. Obviously, world events meant that they had to deviate slightly. But no, I think they had this in their mind from the start, and it just shows that when it's done well, it's wrestling at its best.
Yeah, my hope is that because Darby Allin, he's a feud machine. He creates rivalries with like left, right, and center. I hope he has a similar rivalry with John Moxley. I really want to see those guys link up again because their first two matches are brilliant, particularly their second match for the AEW Championship. Yeah. That's one of my absolute favorite AEW. It's like one of my hidden gems, and I can't wait to dig into it on this match. And they haven't really. They've sort of interacted a little bit. I think they've had like some tag team action together. I think John Moxley or Darby Allin may have saved, like they may have made some saves for one another, but they haven't had a singles match since. And I would love to see them lock up again in a similar way to he's won the first two. I want to see where now Darby Allin's had so much of this stuff going on and has advanced so far. I want to see where they end up if they face each other again. The other one, sorry, I just thought of was Omega and Hangman, because they've only had the two singles matches, well, three actually if you count what they did in New Japan, and you do sort of have that similar build and cross-generational thing going on there, but definitely not. I don't think on the level that this one is. In terms of the way that it emphasizes the coming of a new generation.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there, isn't there, for Darby? Just like, you could put his name against it. No, just as you were mentioning there, I was thinking a Darby Allin versus Bryan Danielson feud would be.
Oh my god!
Incredible. So that, as you said, because you've got the cross-generational thing there, as well as the completely different approaches to life and to everything. There's so much there, and obviously he's already done great work with CM Punk on that front as well. That they could revisit that at some point. He's an integral part of AEW, which just looks at how well they've done.
I've actually got a T-shirt bet with someone that Darby Allin gets a win over CM Punk before CM Punk finishes with AEW. So I think it's easy. I think it's the easiest T-shirt I'm ever going to get personally, but particularly after watching this rivalry. My last question is, do you think that someday down the line Darby Allin becomes AEW champion? And if so, when does that happen?
I think he will. I think he's that level of AEW star now. I think the fans would receive him as a champion, but again, no one cares about his size, or feuds like this with Cody have built that up. When is a tricky one, because there's they do long-term title reigns. There's obviously still a lot to do with Hangman. MJF presumably is got to be in that conversation, and I would imagine would probably be there first. But again, would that not be a great feud to revisit for a world championship of MJF versus Darby Allin? But yeah, I certainly see him being in that that story at some point, and I personally would love to see him lift the title, and I think it would be a great story for AEW from where we were at the start of match 1 in this feud to him lifting that title.
I do also. I agree with you. I think he's a few years away, though. My only worry would be, just given the reckless nature of how he wrestles, that his body doesn't make it long enough. And, you know, in many ways he wrestles like a Joshi. You're a big Joshi fan. And one of the things with Joshis is they do take some insane bumps. Like, you watch a Stardom show, you're going to see some people landing on their necks. But because they're so slight and they're so much lighter than, say, like a Kenny Omega even, or a Kota Ibushi landing on their neck, the impact on their body is lesser, so they can absorb, I guess, more than what bigger blokes can. I wouldn't want to change, but I wouldn't want to change the way that Darby Allin wrestles for the sake of him wrestling longer, and I don't think he wants to either. That's not in his nature. His nature, I think, will be to go at 100 miles an hour, and then when the wheels fall off, and that'll be it. And that will be the only reason I don't think he makes it to the AEW Championship. He has mentioned that he wants to win the TNT Championship again. And as you said, given that, you've got MJF, he's obviously going to be a world champion at some point. I imagine by the end of this year or early next year, probably. I can see them having a feud, but I don't think Darby would win it straight away. I know some people have fantasy booked him as the champion who would take it off MJF. I don't think that would be the case. I think you've also probably got in the works maybe a CM Punk, something for Bryan Danielson, a second Jon Moxley reign. There's a lot that you could do there. And then, maybe one day Cody Rhodes comes back and doesn't have this ridiculous stipulation on his head that he can't challenge for the world championship. Who knows? Who knows what's going to happen in the future?
That's it. I mean, you almost need Darby to try and get it a few times and fail.
Yeah, I agree.
That's rather than the first time. And you're talking there about his potential for injuries, etc. I think he would benefit hugely from not getting injured, but actually going away for 6 months at some point. And because there is a risk with a character like his that you would get the oversaturation. And a returning Darby Allin would be superb. The pop for him coming back, having not been on TV for a while, would be massive. But so we've therefore built in 3 different title reigns, a rest of 6 months, potential injuries. Who knows where we are at that point for him? But no, I'd love to see him to lift that title.
Yep. Dan, I've run out of the questions that I had down to ask. Is there anything else you'd like to say about this feud, this program, or the wrestlers involved before we call it a day?
I think just to reiterate what we've said, just such a well done bit of business across such a long period, and it's why I love AEW. They in the last couple of years, New Japan has really fallen away for me in terms of what they are delivering, partly because of the lack of crowds. I think they've also hit a bit of creative block with Gato having done it for so long, and it really does feel like AEW has taken over that mantle, and I can't give them any more praise than that because when New Japan was doing this sort of storytelling, it was superb, and it's great to see AEW doing it. And as we've just talked about, there's so much more to come for Darby. Who knows what there is to come for Cody? And yeah, I would love to see them go at it again at some point.
Absolutely. I've said it a number of times. This is a fantastic feud. I absolutely adore it, particularly having sat down and watched them pretty much back to back. You do notice the nuance. You notice how things have how they've built on things, and hopefully to you guys listening at home, hopefully we've been able to bring that out in talking about it today. Bit of a longer podcast than we've had before. I think this is going to be the record, but then again, we are talking about 4 matches as opposed to 1. So that is something. Dan, where can the good people find you if they've enjoyed what you've said today and they want to follow you or find you the content that you produce?
So you can find me on Twitter at Wrestling Rhymes, and I'm writing quite a lot about Stardom at the moment on Pro Wrestling Musings. I'm sort of focusing on power rankings and sort of compiling the statistics there as well. So I'd heavily recommend anyone to get into Stardom and other Joshi wrestling if you haven't already. It really is. It's fantastic, and particularly at the moment, Stardom is really about to hit a huge few months.
Yep. Stardom is something that I have down as like, if only I had an extra few hours in my week. There's so much wrestling around, and at this point, AEW is pretty much all I watch in terms of wrestling, unless something, a match or something pops up on the radar in the zeitgeist out there. But yeah, definitely would recommend going to Pro Wrestling Musings. They do some of the most unique and interesting stuff on the internet. And funny you should say that, because next week I've actually got the owner and the founder of Pro Wrestling Musings on the podcast, Craig Williams, and we're looking at Dax Harwood versus Jungle Boy, which is a match where we will really dive deeply into the statistics of it and the real breakdown of the match composition. And it's a fantastic deep dive into that. And Craig is a really great guest. So make sure you join us next week for that. But yeah, look, follow Dan. Dan's a great follow. He's a great lad on Twitter. To have some conversations about wrestling with. And you can find me, of course, on Twitter at Sir_Samuel. As I said at the start, if you have enjoyed what we've done today, you can rate and review the podcast on the podcast app of your choice. You can also recommend it to a friend, post about it on social media, do anything to get the good word out there. And if you want to support us here at the Social Suplex Podcast Network, you can go to redcircle.com. You can just Google Social Suplex or AEW Match Guide, and you can actually donate to us to help keep the lights on and keep the bills paid here. However, Dan, it's been fantastic having you on today. I do appreciate the time. I appreciate you going back and looking at these matches and having a good chat to me about it. So thank you very much for being on today. And thank you to the listeners out there for listening. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing you again next week. Cheers. Bye. Thanks for listening to the AEW Match Guide podcast. If you enjoyed the show, then you can subscribe on the podcast app of your choice so you never miss an episode. Also, feel free to let me know on Twitter at Sir_Samuel. I'd love to hear from you. The AEW Match Guide podcast is brought to you by the Social Suplex Podcast Network, where you can find many other fantastic podcasts discussing not just AEW, but all parts of the world of professional wrestling. Looking forward to seeing you again next week. I'm Sam Brown.